Giordano.
All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Anthony Mills, and I'm the Executive Director of Global Innovation Institute in the United States. And this is our monthly webinar series that Global Innovation Institute puts on. And as you know, just a little background about the Institute. Global Innovation Institute is really the world's leading professional certification, business accreditation, and membership association in the field of business innovation. And we have a program of professional certification that's underwritten by training programs that are delivered by our providers all over the world. We have providers throughout the US and Canada, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Australia, Asia, and the program is very well spread around the world, as well as our business accreditation program that's facilitated by some of our providers around the world too. So, and we encourage everyone to get involved, become a member of the Institute, get involved in our community. We have an online community where people discuss and talk about things that deal with corporate innovation and so forth. And so we very much encourage that. So today we have our monthly webinar, and today our guest with us is Dr. Ed Morrison. And I'm going to introduce Dr. Morrison to you, and then afterwards I'll turn the floor over to him. So to introduce Dr. Morrison is the director of the Agile Strategy Lab at the University of North Alabama. The lab develops new approaches to managing complex collaborations and networks. Ed is also co-author of the book, Strategic Doing, 10 Skills for Agile Leadership, published by Wiley in 2019. Ed started his career in Washington, D.C., where he was a legislative assistant to an Ohio congressman, staff attorney in the Office of Policy Planning for the Federal Trade Commission, and a staff member of the Senate Democratic Policy Committee. In that role, he managed floor legislation involving tax, trade, and competitiveness. After leaving Washington, Ed joined a corporate strategy consulting firm, where he conducted strategy studies for large companies like Ford, Volvo, and General Electric. After his work as a corporate strategy consultant, Ed consulted with communities and regions on how to tackle the complex challenges of building a prosperous economy in an era of globalization. Frustrated with existing approaches to these issues, more than 25 years ago, Ed began working on a new methodology for developing strategy in open, loosely connected networks, now called strategic doing. This work aligns with what scholars now call open strategy. Ed began his academic career in 2003 as the director of the Center for Regional Economic Issues at Case Western Reserve University. In 2005, he moved to Purdue University, where he was a member of the professional staff at the Purdue Center for Regional Development. In 2016, he founded the Agile Strategy Lab at Purdue. And then in 2020, he founded the Agile Strategy Lab at the University of North Alabama. Ed received his BA degree cum laude with honors from Yale University and both his JD and MBA degrees from the University of Virginia. He recently completed his PhD at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia. His dissertation details his journey to develop and deploy strategic doing. Today, Ed will be leading us through strategic doing and explaining the concepts behind it. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ed Morrison. Ed, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Anthony. I'm going to quickly share my screen here and jump right into these slides. But if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll follow through and answer those questions as they come up. But I want to give you an introduction to strategic doing, what it is, where it came from, how it works, why it works. But first, the problem. What's the problem that we tried to set out to solve? And that is, how do we address wicked problems? How do we generate solutions when no one can tell anybody else what to do? This is the core problem that we tried to set out to solve. And here's how it ends up on my desk. It's things like Ernest Andrade coming to me and said, how do we build a digital cluster in Charleston? Or Dr. Samus White in Milwaukee saying, how do we build a water cluster in Milwaukee? There's Ubaldo Cordova, who's down at the University of Puerto Rico, who is saying, ask us, how do we recover after Maria? How do we transform the Puerto Rican economy? Liz Nilsson jumped on us with this question: how do we transform engineering education, undergraduate engineering education at 50 universities under an NSF grant? My colleague up at Michigan State, Bob Brown, came to me in 2013 or so saying, how do we reduce teenage violence, the problem of youth homicides? This is a colleague at Lockheed who said, how do we develop a technology roadmap for the destroyer fleet, the Aegis destroyer fleet? And Elizabeth Taylor, who's an engineer at NASA, how do we build collaboration across the life sciences within NASA? Now, the challenge of all of these is that the problems themselves are complex. The problems are increasingly complex. So you can start out with a simple problem, a technical problem with a clear solution, but as you go up, you start seeing these problems are becoming more and more ill-defined, more and more complex in themselves. But you also have another dimension of complexity, which is that the group of people that you bring together on these or touched by these complex problems increasingly are complex. In other words, we move from teamwork over here to clusters and networks and then stakeholders. So you can start to see that the complexity of the collaboration grows. So strategic doing is designed to deal with these problems, complex problems with complex collaborations. So these are what we call wicked problems. We can think of them as wicked problems, but they have these two dimensions of complexity that have to be addressed. And of course, the broader question is, how do we generate strategy in open, loosely connected networks? How do we do that? How do we generate a strategy when again, nobody can tell anybody what to do? These networks are complex. In order to do this, it's not really rocket science, I'm going to argue. It's actually harder. It's more like molecular biology, because we're dealing with assets that are hidden. Knowledge assets are invisible, they're hidden. And they flow through networks that are also invisible. So this is really quite a challenge to try to figure out how do we focus our knowledge assets toward generating solutions to these complex problems within these open networks. So another challenge that came up during our development is how do we both learn and adapt? So some of you may be familiar with this whole notion of single loop and double loop learning. Most organizations have some kind of routine learning, onboarding processes that work, routines that they teach and follow. But the question is, how do we develop a double loop learning system within that same organization? And these ask questions, a deeper set of questions, which is, are we doing the right thing? Are we doing the right thing? And of course, the problem is that our single loop routine learning systems tend to combat or tend to try to stifle our double loop or adaptive learning. And you see it when you say, well, we just don't do things like that around here. That's not the way we do things. And so they tend to stifle double loop learning. So balancing these two things, single loop and double loop learning within the same organization is tricky. So, and then of course you get this problem, which is how do we develop the trust we need to power collaboration? How do we develop trust across these networks? So one of the ways of thinking about this is that it's an evolutionary process within a set of relationships. So we're all familiar with how trust starts to evolve from our own personal relationships. But what we're really looking for is collaboration. And I'm going to define that fairly rigorously to work that two or more people do together to recombine assets, to innovate, to create something new. That's what I mean by collaboration. It's innovation. in which we create something entirely new. Teamwork is not really necessarily that. Certainly cooperation and the other states of relationships aren't that. So how do we develop the capacity to innovate? Whoops, I'm going backwards here. Let me go forward. There we go. The challenge, of course, is developing patterns of doing and thinking and commitment. Because trust, when you think about it, is an emergent pattern. It emerges out of a pattern of activities, matching our words with our deeds. So when we start to think about this in a context, we have to recognize that we're going through and managing a process. We're managing a process of moving people from perhaps an interested community. So all the employees of General Electric, for example, are an interested community. Within General Electric, there might be communities of practice where their knowledge, they're trying to share knowledge, but you're trying to get to an innovative network. An innovating network is going to have high levels of trust. So how do we get to that? So this is what strategic doing was designed to solve. It's one solution to this problem. Strategic doing is a strategy discipline. It's a discipline designed for teams and open, loosely connected networks. It enables teams to form these collaborations quickly in a matter of hours, move them toward measurable outcomes, and make adjustments along the way. And finally, strategic doing is an open source operating system. In other words, there's no licensing of any technology here. It's a set of skills that you learn. So it's an open source operating system for collaboration, open innovation, and ecosystems. So how do we do this? Strategic doing focuses on our conversations. This is the core technology of strategy and innovation in a knowledge economy. Now, this is not a new idea. Alan Weber, who is the founder of Fast Company magazine, and also an editor at Harvard Business Review, wrote an article in 1993 he said, look, collaboration emerges out of conversation. Knowledge flows through our organizations through conversations. We create and distribute knowledge through our conversations. Conversations are critical. One of the insights that we've learned as we go through this is that people move in the direction of their conversations. This is an insight from cognitive science. So part of the challenge, of course, is how do we design and guide conversations that lead people to opportunities? And of course, if you understand that there is a hidden structure to conversations, then you can design and guide them. Then you can design and guide these conversations. And so what we provide with strategic doing is an understanding of how to implement conversations, how to design and guide them in a way that leads to collaboration. What we are trying to emphasize is that there's a hidden structure to these conversations. It's very predictable, and there's a hidden trajectory to these conversations. They change over time. Now you see this embedded sometimes in design thinking, but we've driven it down to the level of skills. And so in order to do this, we started out with a clean sheet of paper and we said, okay, let's define first strategy. What is strategy? And here we worked off of we leveraged the work of Kathleen Eisenhart out at Stanford to say strategy in dynamic environments is all about answering two simple but not easy questions. Where are we going and how will we get there? Where are we going and how will we get there? Well, in order to have a conversation around those two questions and answer those two questions, we've learned to design the conversation around four questions. What could we do? What should we do? What will we do? And what's our 30-30? That's a term of art within strategic doing that asks us to meet every 30 days and say, what did we learn the last 30 days? What are we going to do the next 30 days? When you design your conversations around these four questions, the first two questions give you an outcome. The second two questions give you a path. So you can take a workshop or a conversation with a set of colleagues and design a conversation with these four questions and generate a strategic action plan. And so, of course, this is a this is a big insight, which is that we can actually do strategy. We can generate the strategy we need for open, loosely connected networks rather quickly. Now, of course, these strategies are not permanent. They're continuously evolving. And so what we end up doing is teaching these skills to people and then having them practice this discipline over time. And so this is the logical structure of strategic doing. 2 questions of strategy, 4 questions of a strategic conversation, and then 10 underlying skills to really master the ability to design and guide these conversations. The main mistake that most people make is that they think, well, because it's simple, it must be easy. And the answer is no, because it's simple, you need practice to master it, just like any real skill. And of course, we were guided by Deming, which is, we have to have a process that we can describe and that we can implement, because if we don't do that, then we don't really know what we're doing. So we also develop strategic doing on platforms. We use the idea of platforms to develop the strategies that bring people from multiple organizations, both within an organization, multiple business units, for example, or within a college or university, within multiple colleges, or within a region, or within an open innovation challenge. And what you design is you design a strategy process that responds to the context within which you're operating. And so you design, much like Lego blocks, you snap this together. And what you'll find is that it takes practice to master this set of skills. It takes practice, and we start to see horizons emerge as the capability of people to design and guide their own strategy starts to develop. We've learned how to manage large-scale projects. Using this, we use what Thomas Balone at MIT would call a loose hierarchy. We prefer to call it a managed network, but it's the idea that you can guide this process by having a common operating system, common language system, and focus on the data that you're generating as you're doing the process. So how did this all develop? Well, it developed over 25 years. There's really 4 big periods of time here. The red period is when I was pretty much a private consultant. At the tail end of that period of time, I was at Case Western Reserve. But the big opportunity I had was at Purdue. Purdue came to me and said, hey, we really like what you're doing. We will support your work and develop it. And so we developed test beds for over a decade. And then in 2016, we launched the Agile Strategy Lab. In 2019, I retired from Purdue. We set up an Agile Strategy Lab at the University of North Alabama. And now we do strategic doing online. And of course, at the culmination of all of that was a PhD at the University of the Sunshine Coast, which was awarded to me just a few months ago. So the initial project that I worked on was in Oklahoma City. And this was, how do we develop a strategy, a business-led strategy to transform Oklahoma City? And what we started to see was by 2010, we had national recognition for this strategy. It was starting to really come through. And then we started to see, before that, in 1999, we started to see tremendous impact from our Lincoln leverage strategies. So we started to also see that we were doing this much more productively than any other economic development organization had ever done it. And so this gave me the confidence to say, okay, I think we've got something here, but we've got to figure out how to teach this. So why does this work? Why does this work? Well, the reason why it works is embedded in this dissertation. I invite you to download it, but I'll summarize it in the next slide. And that is, all 10 rules are supported by scholarly research, multiple streams of research. Now, they all come from different fields, which is interesting, because some of it's in social psychology, some of it's in cognitive psychology, some of it's in behavioral economics, some of it's in strategic management. It comes from a variety of different sources, which is one of the reasons why it's hard to put a label on strategic doing and put it into a disciplinary bucket as they try to do in universities. So how do we know it works? Well, let's go back to Sam White. 2008, he came to us and said, how do we build a water cluster? Within 3 months, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee was developing the cluster of the water cluster in Milwaukee. They identified 4 strategic focus areas and they started implementing. And of course, you can go on the web right now and start looking at the Water Council. It's a global water hub, started in 2008. In 2001, it was Ernest Andrade, a city employee, who came to me and said, how do I build a digital cluster in Charleston? Go online. The Charleston Digital Corridor is now a nationally recognized and indeed internationally recognized hub for digital businesses. Here's Ubaldo. We started training people in Puerto Rico to transform the Puerto Rican economy. And the notoriety that brought him, Ubaldo is now provost of the university. Our colleagues at Lockheed saw the ability to use the idea of platforms and strategic doing to convene 20 outside companies in machine learning, UX, all sorts of different technologies that they didn't have. And we started to build within 6 months a technology roadmap for the deployment of condition-based maintenance across the Aegis destroyer fleet. And what was most interesting to me was this was one of the small companies involved. And he'd been involved with a lot of open innovation projects. And if you've been familiar with that at all, small companies are very reluctant to work with large companies. They tend to really be fearful of that. And so here he saw this was a very effective way to do this. Oh, I'm going backwards again. 50 universities over 3 years generated 500 plus collaborations. We taught these teams how to do it, and we used strategy maps. And then one of the bigger opportunities we've pursued is in Flint. We're really gratified by the work that's going on in North Flint and the neighborhoods there, because we've taught a lot of people how to do strategic doing in North Flint. So most recently, Julio Jose Prado, who had come to Purdue about 3 years ago. He's a PhD, business professor in Ecuador, came to Purdue to learn about strategic doing. In April, he was designated the Minister of Production and Trade. And so he reached out and said, how do I deploy strategic doing across Ecuador? That's his wicked problem. And so now we are deploying strategic doing across Ecuador. We're doing this in Spanish, of course, English and Spanish, but we're focusing on younger entrepreneurs building ecosystems around them. And then, of course, at the tail end of our work was writing a book. And what we've seen is that after we wrote the book, scholars have come to this and said, okay, well, this is really actually very good. It's very practical. It's a very good way to start thinking about teams. And of course, then I was fortunate to meet Yo-Yo Ma, which is an amazing story in and of itself. Yo-Yo is very interested in how cultural organizations can bring communities together. He attended a workshop that I had, and then he offered to write the foreword to our book. So here's some next steps that you could take if you're interested in any of this. Chris, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. Second is next week, early next week, I'll do a really short version of this kind of give you an overview of strategic doing. I do this once a month now because of the interest in it. And so just take down that bit.ly link down there if you want to share this with colleagues and introduce them to strategic doing, what it is, how it developed. You can obviously read the book. Strategicdoing.net is the Strategic Doing Institute website. That's the Institute website that there's a lot of free material, background material on that site. And then on our Agile Strategy Lab website, if you're interested in an online course, you can take an online course there. So with that, I'd like to open the floor to questions, any thoughts, any questions. I'm happy to answer them. So I appreciate the opportunity to work with you.
So Ed, we have a number of questions in the chat window. We can start with those, and then if others have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat window, or you can raise your hand and we can have you ask the question directly. But one of the questions here came from Brian Hennessy. What about the question? You had your 4 core questions there you started with. What could we do? What should we do? And so forth. And he asked a question, what about the question of why? Why are we going there? Is that embedded in what should we do, or where is that?
It's really embedded in the first 2 rules of strategic doing, which I didn't get into, which is the question of a framing question. Before you engage in these 4 questions, what could we do, what should we do, and so on, you have to frame the conversation that you want to have.
Okay.
And we don't frame it in terms of a vision statement or a why statement, a definite statement. We frame it in terms of a question, which is embedded in that question as a hypothesis about where we could go, where might we go. And so the framing question actually acts as the attractor to people. People listen to that framing question. There's a real art to designing those framing questions, and that's how the why question is addressed.
Right. When we think of
Anthony,
go ahead.
Anthony, can I query? Hey Ed, listen, I've been following you for quite a while. we have many friends in common in the stratosphere. My background is at Stanford with the cognitive neuroscience people back there in the 80s. A very interesting time in the 80s. I lectured at the B School, Design School of Engineering when it first started. And I love the fact that the topological modeling, I see a swirling hyperboloid in your model.
Mm-hmm.
When you have the circle and you've got this movement, and I think we're going to see tremendous changes in how we visualize this kind of movement. And I just see that, I see the toroid and I see the hyperboloid coming forward. It's just not common topological seeing.
Brian, you touched on a really interesting topic, which is one of the things I learned in the 90s when I first started to do this is I've got to develop a visual language for this. And it's got to be really simple. It's got to be really simple. And so I actually have a portfolio of about 600 drawings, things that most of them didn't work, right? But the point of this is that this is why I made that point about the fact that this is more like molecular biology. My wife is a molecular biologist. And when I walked into her lab in 2000 and I looked at, she deals with these signaling pathways, apoptosis, natural cell death. And I realized, oh my gosh, this is what she's doing. This is what I've got to do. I've got to be able to, and exactly right. I think this is going to be a much more of a visual medium
world
forward.
And the only other point I want to make, and I know you're here already, it's just that some things the market's ready for and some things it's not, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, the analog world is surfacing. It's beginning to surface. When you talk about people and communication, we're talking about things that people just aren't tangible yet. When you have a room of people getting together and you're building trust, there's this intangible energetic thing you can't even talk about because people say it's foo-foo psychology, whatever. But trust is that fundamental element, is a vibrational element. It's not, and then we talk about the digital world. This is what bothers me. There's nothing digital about human energetic interaction.
Yeah, I'm with you on this. I actually, if you go through a workshop face-to-face, what you see is when people start to move, and that it really hits when they start to think about what psychologists call prospection, which is designing the future together, collective prospection. What does that future look like? When they start to realize that they've got assets that could start to build this future, people start leaning in. They start pointing to each other. This whole notion that is being explored now by Malone up at MIT around collective intelligence, and the notion that our brain is not embedded in our skulls, but it actually is. This is why strategic doing is always going to evolve, and I've told people that when we're really successful, it will disappear.
Ed, just do me a favor. I have a hashtag do. Okay, all so. Right. Because that strategic being, I think, will be the next book.
Mm. Yeah, I'm with you. I think you're right on track. Yep.
All right. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for your contribution. And, Ed, going back to that question we were talking about earlier too, the why, I think about, the generalized sort of design thinking and to some degree creative problem solving approach is, a lot of times we'll work the problem space
This
first.
is where I was just talking.
We'll work the problem space first.
Yep.
And then that's where we frame it from. Brian, you might want to mute yourself.
Yes, hi there. I was just sharing with my wife the fact that Ed is a globally recognized human being.
All right, very good. So a lot of times we will define the problem space and then we'll reframe the problem.
Right.
And that framing, I think that maybe that's what you're talking about, because when we get to the question of what could we do and what should we do, and I think we moved over to the solution space at that point. So does strategic doing itself include working the problem space and going through all the hypothesis formation and experiment design and testing hypothesis?
Well, it doesn't. You test hypotheses by doing things. So you test hypotheses by coming up with framing questions to see what kind of attraction. The framing question is kind of an attractor or a watering hole that brings people together and starts to engage them. And the fact is that this is a very lean, fast way of doing things. So you can test a bunch of different hypotheses. It's not an analytic exercise in that sense that you have to have the right, perfect framing question. No, any organization, any community I've ever been in has a strategic conversation ongoing. They've had people talk, now a lot of it in many ways, it's a conversation that looks backwards, what we could have done or what we should have done. What you do have is you start identifying people who are looking forward, and every community, every organization I've ever been in has people who are looking at the design of the future that they want to create. And so the challenge, of course, is can we build networks around that future? In other words, it's not just one vision. It's not one vision. It's a conversation that tests hypotheses and moves us to action. Are we creating value when we do this? Are we capturing value? So you have to start thinking about business models to go forward with this. I mean, when we were working with like the Water Council or with the digital corridor in Charleston, you got to be thinking, or Oklahoma City, you've got to be thinking about business models day one. What value are you creating? How will that value be shared? If you're moving forward, who signs the check? Who's going to sign the check? And so you have to have hypotheses about, hey, this is going to, and that's what you're testing and you're starting to move forward with the frame.
So the whole framing process is something that emerges out of the conversations, and it's part of the conversational process itself.
Yeah. So in NASA's case, for example, it took us about, I'd say 6 weeks to come up with a proper framing question that didn't trip over the existing barriers within NASA. So we had to come up with a framing question. There's a good bit of literature around why strategy thinking is all dialectical, but this whole notion that you got to create a framing question that brings people together. And how do you do that without, again, tripping over existing power structures, language? I mean, people have language problems that they have to negotiate, and so this is actually fairly tricky in places like NASA. Now, the good news is that there's some interesting work that we're doing with an Australian firm that's building a design front end. We can build a design front end of strategic doing, and so we're exploring that. How do we start to see where these hidden networks are of assets and possibilities? Where are they? To Brian's point, we use forums to identify where are the networks. How do we create these networks? How do we, where are the nodes of passion, if you will think about it that way? And so these are all invisible. You can't see them. So you have to do things. Yeah.
Let's go on to the next question in our chat here. It's from Atif Khan. It says, aren't alignment of vision and passion to achieve prerequisites to making innovation through collaboration workable, considering open innovation is different between stakeholders?
Well, it's not an either or a linear process. Typically people will be drawn to a conversation when they see an interest, a potential self-interest in that conversation. When they say, oh, this is kind of interesting. I'm willing to invest an hour. I'm willing to invest an hour and a half. But they're not typically, if they haven't worked together, they don't have necessarily high levels of trust. So this is the point of those early slides, which is you have to design and manage a process that builds trust coincident with the development of ideas. And you have to do things. You can't just talk about it. You can't just talk. And so that's why moving into action is so critical, because it's through those patterns of activity that trust emerges over time.
Give us some examples of what kind of actions are you talking about?
Well, so let's go to the hard question of Flint, right? So Flint comes to us and says, all right, we need to reduce teenage homicides, and people don't like it. North Flint is the black area of town. Downtown is obviously the white area of town. They don't trust each other. They don't know each other. Well, how do you start to break that down? Well, the first thing that Bob did, and when he started, Bob Brown did at Michigan State, was he brought people together, and then he created the first rule of strategic doing, which is we're going to behave in ways that build trust and mutual respect. In other words, there's guidelines here. You can't be a jerk. We're not going to put up with it. We're not going to put up with it. And then what he did, which was fascinating, was he flattened the hierarchy. And how he did that was ingenious. What he did was he said, all right, take out your business cards. Now, of course, all the white people said, okay, well, I'll take out my business card. The black folks in the room, most of them didn't have business cards. So all of a sudden it's like, okay, what's really going on? He then turned around and he took a trash can and he passed it around. He said, put your business cards in the trash can because we don't care. We don't care. We're all residents of Flint. We're all residents of Flint. We all are here because we're trying to keep our kids from killing each other. So part of this is how you design and guide the conversation to build trust. And this is one of the reasons why when you get into strategic doing, you'll know that we can the term facilitator. We don't use the term facilitator. We use the term guide. This is important because a guide is a person who's on the journey with you. The guide has assets. He or she is in the raft as you're going down the river or on the trail going up. And the guide is going to help you, is going to guide you. But it's ultimately the responsibility of the guide to manage that conversation in ways that build trust.
And I think you're touching on our next question in the chat here. Giordano said, talking and building trust. In my experience, it takes years of committed work and relation building, especially in developing ecosystems. How have you really found the recipe for accelerating this?
Yeah, it can take years if you don't have a discipline, I think. And so part of what strategic doing does is we focus on what we call micro commitments, everybody taking small steps. And pretty quickly, you start to identify what happens when people start to build trust. They say what they're going to do and they do it. And then those people who say what they're going to do and they don't do it, or they behave in a way that doesn't reinforce respect and mutual respect. So what actually happens there? Well, my wife is Chinese, and so I'll give you an insight of what happens in a Chinese network when people start having a sense of this person's not trustworthy. What happens is that person starts to get moved out of the network. They get them moved out of the network. They start to move them out of the network. And that's what we want in strategic doing, because the people who are not trustworthy are not going to do anything. They're not going to innovate. We need new systems now. The old systems don't work across the world. They don't work. So we need to design the new systems. Stop trying to fix old systems. Start thinking about what are we going to design for new systems. And in order to do that, if you have rapid iterative cycles, Giordano, and you create these cycles and it's visible, transparency is your friend in a network, and you have a discipline, you can actually create trust at a much faster rate. And so that was the basic notion of strategic doing, which is if I can teach this, we can do it faster.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I'm reading your book, so it's fascinating. But this is a very important concept for the work that I do in developing economies, and where mainly inaction has led to lack of trust, and rebuilding that is. I mean, really, if you found a way to do this quickly and really to shorten the process. I mean, this process is worth millions for me.
Well, it's worth a lot of money, but that's one of the reasons we open sourced it. So, you know, but we're running into this problem in Ecuador. Let me tell you, we're running into this problem in Ecuador. Ecuador has been through a very difficult time, last decade. No single institution has been trusted by young people, 35 to 50 years old, the young leaders that we're dealing with. They say, look, the church isn't trustworthy, the university is not trustworthy, the government's not trustworthy, business is not, it's not trustworthy. So stop trying to look at an institution to solve this problem, to fix this problem. Instead, start building networks around what? Trusted networks that you have. So last night for 2 hours, I was with a group that's focused on non-traditional markets in food in Ecuador with indigenous producers, entrepreneurs living in the end. You know, how do you build it one network at a time, and you teach people how to do it so that they can replicate it. That's what, you know, if it's only me that can do this, as we were talking earlier, Giordano, you run into a real bottleneck. But if you can teach people how to collaborate, then just like Linux, you could build value-added models on top of it. Entrepreneurship models, all sorts of different types of models can be built on top of this. But core to everything is this notion that, hey, it's all about a network. And that means we have to collaborate, because that's the only way you create value in a network, is through innovation, collaboration. And if we know how to do this, then we can speed it up.
Ed,
Thank you.
Tammy wanted to know, as organizations implement the approach or framework, what are some of the common challenges or pain points they've encountered?
Yeah, so the biggest mistake people make is that it's a workshop that once you do it, it's done. No. Or they start to think of me or our team as consultants. Oh, you've got the answer. No, we don't. So part of the challenge, of course, is you've got to encourage people to think differently, to behave differently, and to do their work together differently. This requires practice. It's no different. There's a wonderful study about, I used to be a competitive swimmer, and there's a wonderful study about what makes an Olympic swimmer. You know, I was nationally recognized when I was 13 years old. I thought I was going to the Olympics, but I didn't make it. Anyway, the point of this is that the thing that separates top performers in swimming is not that they put more time into it. They don't put more time into it. They pay attention to every little detail, their start, their turns, how their hands are structured, every little detail. And leaders now have to focus on every little detail of their conversation. That's why there's 10 skills here. And the mistake people make is that they think, oh, this is easy. No, it's simple, but it's not easy. It takes practice.
The tendency to sort of want to accelerate makes them sort of overlook those details, right? So, and that's the challenge when I sort of try to
well, you know, so Tammy, there's paradoxes here. There's a lot of paradoxes, which is if you want to go fast, okay, you want to really transform, like Ecuador. Julio wants to really, he's got 4 years, he wants to transform Ecuador. The secret is go slowly at first. Go slowly at first. Don't skip the steps. Teach everybody the skills. Go slowly at first, because when you go slowly at first, you'll accelerate. But if you go too fast at first, you'll fail.
So Ed, Shane had a question, and Shane, if you want to unmute, you can ask the question. Otherwise, I can read your question here, or I'll start out as we wait for him. So Shane was saying he loves the concept of shared leadership, particularly in the context of openly and loosely connected networks. He's read the case study on Duquesne University, but love it if you could give us another example of that practice. Or Shane, if you want to explain more, Shane.
When I started sort of reading about it, it grew on me, and I wanted to I've read the case study, Ed, on the book, which I carry very often, and feel really inspired by going through some of the stuff, and you just see the application of that in the context of the open and loosely connected that we're building and developing, with your encouragement as well, of course. So quite privileged to have that. So I just wanted to ask you, are there any other examples you could cite this in practice, this concept of shared leadership, maybe ideally in relation to that draft action plan, and that piece seemed to be really important from a strategy execution sort of perspective, I felt.
Yeah. So part of it is that when you're trying to transform using networks, one of the first things we ask people is you have to have a core team. You have to have shared leadership. You can't do this by yourself. It's not a hierarchical model. There's not one leader. And the best way to think about this, and there's good science here, guy at the University of Michigan has done some wonderful, Scott Page has done some wonderful work on cognitive diversity in complexity. Why do you need cognitively diverse people to be looking at a complex problem? Now, what we've done is we've partnered with Human Insight in the Netherlands. So we teach strategic doing in Dutch, but we partner with Human Insight because Human Insight has developed a very compelling model about how do we identify where we are on an S-curve. In other words, all of the skills that we talk about, the 10 skills, you can array them on an S-curve. The initial skills are very ambiguous. They're more horizontal. They're kind of thinking about their improvisational thinking. When you get to the end of the skills, they're very much more top of the S-curve type of questions. Who's going to do what? How are you going to manage this process? It's very program oriented. What we've learned with Human Insight is that people can operate all along the S-curve. You can operate all along the S-curve. I was trained as a lawyer. I can operate at the top of the S-curve. I just don't like doing it. It's a hard thing for me to do. I have to really work at it. I'm much more comfortable. My gift is much more in the early stage of the S-curve. But I need people in my team, in our team, that can manage this S-curve with me. So as an example, I can come up with great ideas for new courses, but now we have to design the curriculum and we have to move that curriculum online. Well, that's a different set of skills. And then we have to have someone at the top who's making sure that people are registering for this project and are actually taking this and to a certain extent paying us to do this. So I have to have people all along this S-curve. When I got to Purdue, that's when everything shifted for me, because I went from, I've got this great idea, I'm going to, me, to, oh my gosh, this is too hard for one person to do. I need a team. So we started out with 3 people on our team. It's never a big team. That's the other point. It's never a big team. We started Oklahoma City with 6 people. Charleston Digital Corridor with 2 people. We do strategic doing on strategic doing. Our core team is no more than 8 people. You don't need a big team, but you need the capacity to work together, to know when it is that you need to hand off to someone else because it's not in your wheelhouse. And if you don't do that, if you try to do, and I'm 71 years old, so I've got some 80-year-old friends who won't give up. They're holding on to their, I've got my model. This is my model. Well, guess what? As soon as you pass away, your model's going with you. I mean, you haven't let go. You haven't let go, and that's a hard process. Yeah.
And I speak to a couple of things that really triggered me. Okay, number one is you don't have the shoulders to be an Olympian swimmer.
I learned I don't have the height. That's what killed me. I didn't.
This is what is interesting, because you spoke about your place on the S curve that you love and the place on the S curve that you need collaborative help with.
Yeah.
So we're speaking about human complementarity, right?
Right.
You know, when you talk about cognitive neuropsych, you talk about cognitive skills that are innate and developed.
Mhm.
The entire work of my firm and our startup is about helping people discover what makes them unique.
Yeah.
I do not use the word special. I never use the word special. Okay. So uniqueness refers to this collaborative way of doing things, because you need complementarity in a system or a group.
Yeah, that's
You
right.
need
And
those people.
that's why, you know, I have friends of mine who are in the leadership, you know, the leadership business. They do, you know, leadership Evansville or leadership, you know, these leadership programs. And I've been imploring them, stop trying to pick the leaders. Stop trying to do that. Everybody has the potential to be a leader. Everybody has a gift. Now, they can't do it by themselves. They have to have teams. They have to have collaborations. And their skills at doing that are going to determine how far they go on their path. You know, if I'm a real jerk, strategic doing is not going to go anywhere. You know,
Are you aware of the work of Chris Patton, the Guild
yeah.
work?
Yeah, oh yeah, he's another one of my colleagues on
Well,
LinkedIn.
Well, he's just moved to HSBC, as you know. He was at Centrica. What's interesting about your model is it works best with incredibly dysfunctional hierarchy. So it works best when the hierarchy is an asshole.
Well, you know, one of the things that, you know, we had this problem last night in Ecuador. Okay, so a lot of these, and it's predominantly, I'd say 60% of the class is women. Again, they're producing small scale products for the export market. They're just trying to get going. You know, it's small business, but it could be big business. It could be big business. And one of the things that they're concerned about is that they've had a whole history of people telling them, you can't do this, it's not going to work. And so part of the challenge is to tune that out and to give people the power to hold a conversation where they don't have to listen to that narrative, because I've told them that narrative doesn't work. I mean, you know, how many people have told me that this isn't going to work? I mean, a lot of people. And so, you know, and I've gotten fired from jobs for doing this kind of stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of opposition to, you know, a lot of current structures don't want to change. I got it. But our kids and our grandkids can't have those structures. Those structures don't work. We know this. So we, as leaders now, have to help people design what's next. And that's what we have to be focused on. And so don't pay attention to the naysayers. They never built anything. They never, you know, maybe it's a power thing, maybe it's a money thing. Got it. You know, it was a jolt to me in Louisiana in the early 90s. When I realized just how much money people were making off of poverty. It's like, wow. And that's part of the reason the system is so structured, so stable, is that, you know, it's not going to change with the current dynamic. So we can create a new dynamic using networks, managing our conversations, accelerating innovation. You know, Shane's got this great idea. Okay, Shane, I'm going to pitch what you're doing. Shane's working on a really cool idea about the carbon footprint of the internet. We can reduce the carbon footprint of the internet, and you need to talk to Shane about it. Giordano is doing incredible work all over the world. You know, I saw Vitor here earlier on. Vitor is from Brazil. I'm working with him on an innovation corridor outside Sao Paulo. I mean, these people are doing great stuff. That's where we need to focus. Stop worrying about all the jerks in the world.
So Ed, Detlef had some questions for us. I'm going to turn it over to Detlef and let him ask his questions, and that'll probably bring us towards the top of the hour and wrap it up here. So Detlef, are you there?
Perfect.
Hello, the hour. Yeah, I am. You guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, Ed.
Right.
Nice to meet you.
Me too.
I've been listening carefully, and I have your book in front of me as well. The question I was curious about is I'm in the midst of probably some craziness. It's a huge transformation. We're going towards communities. We I work in a company for 100,000 people. We're going full steam networks. We're trying to build network capabilities. Leadership has shifted. Hierarchies removed. Functions gone. And in the midst of this, what I'm trying to do is find the right balance between what we had in the past, which is foresight. Strategy meant that I have a certain sense of where we're going, and there's a roadmap, and that gives people some structure they need to find some orientation. While you're building networks and network capabilities and brokers and catalysts and all those different elements that you're putting in place. But sometimes it's like a disbalance. It looks like turmoil all over. And while people are desperate to get a bit more structure, a bit more foresight in these iterative 90-day cycles, where you always think, okay, what's next? And you have to adjust again. I think people are fine with adjusting, but the balance between this is what I would be curious about.
Well, this is, you touch on why it is that I call strategic doing a discipline. So it's a set of rules, and it provides that sense of certainty in when you're dealing with real ambiguity, when you're really dealing with really tough problems. And that's what I tried to emphasize. And so, there is no one solution to these wicked problems. There's multiple solutions. And we have to, the process that strategic doing focuses on is recombinant innovation, which is recombining the assets we already have in our networks that are already embedded in the networks that we have, in the organizations that we have. And so part of the challenge, of course, is how do we build that discipline within ourselves to deal with the ambiguity? And that's what strategic doing provides, because I don't think now, at the same time, we've done work with strategic foresight and scenarios. And yes, those are all helpful ways of thinking about the future. This is not the only way to think about the future. But what it does do is it enables people to engage. And for us who've been in the situation like Giordano, for example, we have to be able to teach people these skills, because if we can't scale it, then, all we're doing is, 3 more Oklahoma cities, and so who cares? And so Giordano and I have talked about this. But if you can teach these skills to people, then they can build their own sense of what the future is, and they can bring in design thinking, appreciative inquiry, whatever works for them. That's fine. Whatever works for them. But at the core is the capacity to collaborate. That's the capacity to collaborate. And that's what the skills are. Regardless of what model you're using, you're in a network world now. Everything's connected to everything else. And we've got to be able to self-manage teams, encourage self-managed, self-directed teams, but we also have to manage things in a professional way. We have to generate data. We have to figure out what works. We can't be sloppy with the money that investors give us. All of that. This isn't an easy thing to do. If it were easy, I would have done this years ago, but it's not easy. What's required of us now? That's what's required of us now.
Well, I want to thank everyone. And Ed, this is an awesome topic. I get a sense we could talk for 2 or 3 hours on this probably, and unending. And, one of the things we teach in a lot of our work is stakeholder management, and how to really work with stakeholders and think about what are their needs, or what's in it for me in each case. And then how do we work to really find the win-win to get everyone's with them. And so I think strategic doing is a fantastic approach to really engaging stakeholders and getting all the right stakeholders together and just taking action together. So it's fantastic. So, I just want to thank you for that. I want to thank everyone for attending today and for being present and for contributing your time to this conversation. It's an ongoing conversation. Like Ed mentioned in the beginning, if you want to connect with him on LinkedIn, feel free to do so. I also put in the chat window the link for the event he has next week. And of course, if you want to connect with me, feel free to do so. So with that, I'll thank everyone for attending and wish you a very wonderful day, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you all.